The moment Walter Reed walked into the dusty Spur saloon and sat down alone at the corner table, Opal Doyle knew he was a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and she could not look away. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Harrow Creek, Texas, sat baking under a relentless sun that turned the red dirt roads the color of dried blood. The town was neither prosperous nor dying. It simply existed the way most frontier towns did, clinging to the earth with stubborn, sun-bleached fingers, full of cattle drivers, homesteaders, drifters, and people who had run out of somewhere else to go. The dusty Spur occupied the longest building on the main strip, its wooden sign warped from years of wind and heat, its floorboards groaning under the weight of boots and secrets alike. Opal had been working there for 3 months, serving meals and pouring drinks, and she had developed an eye for the kind of man who came in needing something more than whiskey. Walter Reed was definitely that kind of man. He was 32 years old, broad through the shoulders, with hands that were calloused and rough in the way that only came from years of hard outdoor work. His jaw carried a few days of dark stubble, and his eyes were the particular shade of gray-green that made you think of a sky before a storm, not threatening, but charged with something unspoken. He wore a tan canvas shirt, faded at the elbows, and a brown leather vest that had seen better decades. His hat, a wide-brimmed affair the color of charcoal, was pushed back just slightly from his forehead as he settled into the chair in the far corner, the one tucked closest to the wall where a man could keep his back to solid wood and his eyes toward the door. He did not look at the other patrons. He did not nod at the card players who had claimed the center table, nor did he acknowledge the 2 cowboys at the bar who were debating the moral character of a mutual acquaintance with considerable volume. He simply sat, folded his hands on the table, and stared at them the way a person stares at something that is not actually there. Opal finished delivering a plate of salt pork and cornbread to a table near the window, tucked her tray under her arm, and made her way over to him. She was 26 years old, with dark auburn hair she kept pinned back when she was working, though loose strands always found a way free by noon. She was not a small woman. She stood straight and moved with the kind of practical efficiency that came from years of doing everything herself, and her dark brown eyes had a directness to them that most men found either comforting or slightly unnerving depending on their conscience. "What can I get you?" she asked, stopping at the edge of his table. He looked up. Those gray-green eyes found her face, seemed to process her, and then something in his expression shifted, not warmly, not coldly, just a quiet acknowledgement that she existed and was waiting. "Whatever is hot," he said. His voice was low, a little rough at the edges like it did not get much use. "That would be the beef stew. We have cornbread alongside it. That is fine. Coffee or water?" He seemed to think about this longer than the question warranted. "Coffee," he finally said. "Coming right up," Opal replied, and she turned back toward the kitchen, but she glanced at him once over her shoulder before she pushed through the door. He had already returned to staring at his hands. She set his food down 8 minutes later. He ate steadily, methodically, watching the door in that quiet way of his, and he left 2 coins on the table when he was done, the exact price of the meal, not a penny more or less. He put his hat back on before he stood, and he walked out without making eye contact with anyone. The whole transaction had been perfectly ordinary, and yet Opal stood at the bar for a moment after the door swung shut behind him, watching the space where he had been, thinking about the particular quality of aloneness that had surrounded him like a second coat. "That fellow been in before?" she asked Gus Halloran, the bartender, a red-faced Irishman of considerable girth and good humor. "Walter Reed," Gus said, wiping the bar with a rag that accomplished very little hygienically. "Ranches about 4 miles east. Has a spread out there he works mostly alone. Had a partner once, couple of fellers actually, but that was a while back. He comes in maybe once a week, eats, leaves. Never causes trouble. What happened to his partners?" Gus shrugged his large, indifferent shoulders. "Don't rightly know the whole of it, Some folks say one of them died, other one moved on. Reed doesn't talk about it, doesn't really talk about much of anything if I'm being honest. Opal nodded slowly. Does he have family in town? Not that anyone's ever seen. She thought about that for the rest of her shift, and when she walked back to the small room she rented at the back of the boarding house 2 blocks down, she thought about it some more before she fell asleep. Walter Reed came back the following Wednesday, same table, same hour. Beef stew again, coffee black, 2 coins exact. The Wednesday after that, the same. Opal began to understand without being told that this was a ritual for him, that this weekly meal was probably the most social contact he allowed himself, and that even this bare minimum of human proximity cost him something she could not yet name. By the 4th Wednesday, she had started noticing the other things. The way his coffee cup sat untouched for 5 minutes before he remembered it and drank half of it in one go. The way he kept his hat on even while eating, as if he might need to leave quickly. The way he always chose the chair that faced the room, never the one with its back to the door, not out of aggression, she thought, but out of a kind of exhausted vigilance. The habit of a man who had learned that the world could surprise you in painful ways and had decided to try to see it coming. On the 5th Wednesday, there was a problem with the kitchen stove. Hector, who cooked for the Dusty Spur and did so with reliable if unspectacular competence, had managed to get a grease fire going that was not dangerous but was disruptive. And the upshot was that the only food available for a stretch of time was bread and cold cuts. Most patrons accepted this with the philosophical resignation of frontier life. A few grumbled. One very large drover expressed his dissatisfaction with considerable creativity. Walter Reed was already at his corner table when Opal came over to explain. "I am sorry," she said. "We had a fire incident in the kitchen. Hot food will not be ready for another hour at least. I can offer you bread and some cold smoked beef and pickled vegetables, or you are welcome to wait." He looked at her. He looked at the table, he looked back at her. "Cold is fine," he said. She brought him a generous plate. She always gave him generous portions. She had noticed herself doing it without deciding to, as though she could compensate for something she sensed was missing in his life through the medium of extra cornbread, and she set it down in front of him. He nodded his thanks, which was his version of enthusiasm. She was turning to go when a group of 4 men came through the door, loudly claiming the large round table in the center of the room. They were cattle buyers, she thought, or maybe land surveyors. They had that soft, city-adjacent quality of men who worked with numbers rather than their hands, and one of them was already demanding table service with the particular authority of a man unaccustomed to doing anything for himself. The room got louder. Gus was occupied at the bar with a dispute about change. Hector was managing the smoldering kitchen. The other saloon girl, a capable young woman named Delia who had a newborn baby and was working half days, had gone home at noon. Opal was the only one available, and the center table needed attention, and the window table needed attention, and the 2 men at the bar needed refills. And in the middle of all this, she became suddenly aware that the bread basket she had meant to bring to Walter Reed was still sitting on the serving counter where she had forgotten it. She looked at his table. He had already finished the cold beef. She had not given him enough. She realized, not with a big man and a cold meal, and he was sitting with his hands around his coffee cup, which was empty, and he was looking at nothing again. Not impatiently, just quietly. Already returned to wherever it was he went when no one needed anything from him. Without fully thinking it through, Opal picked up the bread basket, crossed the room, and set it on his table. Then she looked at the crowded room and looked at her own feet for 2 seconds, made a decision that surprised even her, and pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. He went very still. It was not the stillness of offense or alarm. It was something more complicated than that. He looked at the chair she had taken, then at her, as though confirming that what was happening was actually happening. "The room is a little chaotic tonight," she said, which was not entirely untrue. I have a spare moment while Hector sorts out the kitchen. I hope you do not mind the company." For a long moment he said nothing. He turned the empty coffee cup in his hands once, twice. Then he said very quietly, "I do not get much of that." "I noticed," she said just as quietly. Something moved across his face, surprise, she thought, and something beneath that, something rower. He looked down at the table, and then he reached out and took a piece of bread from the basket, and he ate it slowly, as if he were buying himself time to figure out what to do with the fact that a person had come and sat down across from him of their own volition. "Walter Reed," he said finally, looking up. "Opal Doyle," she replied. "You are the one who serves the food here." "I am." "You always give me extra," he said. It was not an accusation. It was a careful observation, stated neutrally but with something behind it, curiosity maybe, or something gentler. Opal felt warmth move up the back of her neck. "You look like you could use it," she said honestly. He almost smiled. It was the smallest possible movement of the corner of his mouth, gone before it fully arrived. But it had been there and she had seen it, and she filed it away with the careful attention of someone who understood that with certain people, the small things were the whole story. The noise from the center table surged as the cattle buyers apparently reached some kind of disagreement. Opal rose, because duty called and bread baskets did not deliver themselves, but she met Walter Reed's eyes one more time before she turned away. "I will refill your coffee before I go," she said. "I would appreciate that," he told her. She brought the coffee and he wrapped both hands around the cup, and for just a moment, one single still moment in the loud, hot, lamplit chaos of the saloon, he looked like a man who had been standing in the cold for a very long time and had just been handed something warm. She thought about that look all the way home. The following Wednesday he came in at his usual time. Opal was already watching the door from behind the bar, though she was telling herself she was watching for Delia, who was running late. When Walter Reed walked in and went to his corner table, she felt something small and certain settle in her chest, the way a compass needle finds north. This time, when she brought his food, she lingered a moment after setting it down. "Hector made extra cornbread today," she said. "It will go stale otherwise." "Then I suppose someone had better eat it," he said, and this time the almost smile went a fraction further. She refilled his coffee twice that evening without him asking, and each time she had an additional reason to stop at his table. Once because she noticed a candle had burned low and needed replacing. Once because she genuinely did want to ask if the stew was too salty, which it was that night, because Hector had been distracted by a conversation about horse prices. And each time she stayed a moment or two, and each time Walter Reed responded to her in that careful, quiet way of his, choosing his words like a man who had learned that saying the wrong thing cost more than saying nothing. She learned that he had grown up in Kansas, that he had come to Texas 12 years ago with a man named Cobb Perkins, his oldest friend, and that together they had built the ranch from raw land. She learned that there had been a third man, a younger fellow named Davis, who had come on as a hand about 6 years back and become part of the operation. She learned these things slowly, a sentence or two per visit, because that was the only speed at which Walter Reed shared anything. It was on her third week of deliberately lingering that she learned about the accident. She had not pushed. She had long since understood that pushing this man would gain you nothing but his absence. But one evening in early June, when the saloon was quieter than usual and the June bugs were hammering themselves against the lantern glass outside, he had been watching the door for a longer stretch than normal, and she had simply said gently, "You all right?" And he had looked at her with those storm weather eyes and said, "Cobb died 4 years ago. Davis left the year after. Since then it has just been me." The simple, flat weight of it landed on her like something physical. She sat down across from him then without asking, because it had become a thing she sometimes did now, in the quiet moments between rushes, and he had stopped looking surprised when she did it. "I am sorry about Cobb," she said. "He was a good man," Walter replied. "Better than most." He paused. It was a fence accident, a wire under tension. It was fast. He said this in the deliberate way of a person who has rehearsed the words many times in private, has worn them smooth by repetition until they are something he can hold without cutting himself. I have thought many times that there was something I could have done differently that day. I am still not sure if that is true or just the way grief lies to you. Opal did not say the easy thing. She did not say he could not have known or that it was not his fault, because she had found that those phrases, however well-intentioned, had a way of closing doors rather than opening them. Instead, she said, "That is one of the cruelest things about losing someone. The mind keeps replaying it, trying to find the different ending." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly it." She looked at him steadily. "You have been out there alone for 4 years. More or less. That is a long time." "It is," he agreed. And then, quietly, as if saying it to himself rather than to her, "I had not thought of it as long until just now." She felt something in her chest pull toward him with a force that was both sudden and, she realized, not sudden at all. It had been building since the first time he had walked through that door looking like a man who did not know how to need anything. She was careful about this feeling. She was a practical woman, not give to sentiment she had not examined, and she turned it over carefully in the days that followed to make sure she understood what it was. It was not pity. She had encountered enough pity in her own life. She had come to Harrow Creek from Missouri, after her father's farm had failed and her mother had passed, and her one serious romantic prospect had turned out to be secretly engaged to someone else, to know exactly what pity felt like and how little nourishment it contained. This was not that. This was something that recognized something. The particular frequency of a person who had learned to be alone, not because they were cold or cruel, but because the alternative had become too expensive. And she understood that frequency in her bones because she had lived inside a version of it herself. She was different from him in one essential respect, though. She still wanted. She still believed in the stubbornly practical way that was her nature, that wanting things was not weakness but necessity, that you could acknowledge loss and grief and still reach toward the future with both hands. Walter Reed, she was coming to understand, had stopped reaching. He had not stopped caring. She could see care in the way he listened, in the rare but genuine quality of his attention when he gave it. But he had simply shut the reaching mechanism down, the way you close a well that keeps coming up dry to protect yourself from the disappointment. She decided, with the same uncomplicated certainty with which she made most of her decisions, that this was not acceptable. It was July when she made her move, and she did it in the most pragmatic way she could think of. She owned slightly in theory, definitively in intention, a small kitchen garden at the side of the boarding house where she lived. She had cleared the plot herself, turned the earth herself, planted seeds in the early spring that were now producing a modest but genuine harvest of beans, tomatoes, and herbs. The tomatoes in particular had done extraordinarily well, far more than one person could eat. She put some in a cloth sack and brought them to the dusty spur the following Wednesday. When Walter Reed came in and sat at his corner table, she brought his stew and his coffee and then, casually, set the sack beside his plate. He looked at it. "Tomatoes," she said. "From my garden. I have far too many and I cannot eat them all before they turn." He opened the sack and looked inside. He was quiet for a moment. "They are good tomatoes," he said, meaning it as a compliment to whoever had grown them. "They are," she agreed. "The soil at the side of the boarding house is surprisingly decent." He looked up at her with an expression she was beginning to learn, the one where he was doing some internal calculation about whether to say something. "You grow a garden," he said. "I do. I have a kitchen garden at the ranch that has not been tended in a while," he said carefully. "It grew all right on its own for a year or two, but it has got away from me. There are some things still living in it, but they are not happy." This, she understood perfectly well, was not just a statement about a garden. "I could come out and have a look at it sometime," she said, "if you wanted an extra set of eyes." He looked at her for a long moment. "You would do that?" "I would." Another internal calculation. "All right," he said. That Sunday, Opal borrowed one of the Dusty Spur's horses, a sturdy gray mare that Gus Halloran kept for deliveries and did not use enough, and rode 4 miles east along the red dirt road that ran out of Harrow Creek into the open range. The landscape changed gradually. The flat scrub broke into rolling low hills, and the hills were dotted with mesquite and occasional live oaks, and then she came over a rise and saw the ranch below her, and stopped the mare for a moment just to take it in. It was a working ranch, practical and unadorned, and it told the story of two men building something together as clearly as any book could. The main house was solid and well constructed, cedar plank siding and a covered porch. Nothing fancy but nothing neglected, or at least, nothing that had been neglected structurally. What she could see, even from the rise, was the absence that had settled over it in the past 4 years, the way a house shows when someone has been living in it alone, not because it falls apart but because the small maintenance of life, the swept porch, the mended gate, the flower boxes tends to slip when there is no one to see it. The kitchen garden was along the east side of the house. She found it after tying the mare to the fence post and walking around the porch. Walter was already there, standing at the edge of it, looking at it with the particular expression of a man confronting a thing he has been avoiding. It was not as bad as she had expected. There were weeds, certainly, and the bean rows had gone to wild, and something had gotten into one corner and left general ruin. But there were tomato plants still putting out fruit, and some herbs that had survived by virtue of being very stubborn, and the bones of the garden were good. The soil was dark and well watered by the creek that ran nearby. "It is not terrible," she said, coming to stand beside him. "It is not terrible," he replied. She laughed. It came out quick and genuine, and she saw him blink at the sound of it, as if it had caught him off guard, and then something softened in his face. They worked for 3 hours. She pulled weeds and he pulled weeds, and they reset the bean rows, and she showed him how to prune the tomato plants back to concentrate the growth, and he listened with genuine attention and asked good questions. At some point, he went inside and came back with 2 cups of water from the well, and handed her one without ceremony, and she drank it standing in the garden with dirt on her gloves and her hair coming down from its pins in the heat. "Thank you," he said toward the end when they were surveying what they had accomplished. "I had not looked at this in a long time." She understood he did not just mean the garden. "It will keep better now," she said, "if you give it a little attention each week." "I will do that." She was untying the mare when he said from behind her, "Would you want to come back next Sunday if you are free? I could make coffee at least." She turned to look at him. He was standing with his thumbs hooked in his vest pockets, his hat pushed back on his head, and he looked, for the first time since she had known him, like a man who wanted something and was not sure if he was allowed to want it. "Yes," she said simply. "I would." She rode back to Harrow Creek with the late afternoon sun at her back, and she was smiling before she was halfway down the road. August in Harrow Creek was the kind of heat that made you believe in things you normally dismissed: mirages, short tempers, the general indecency of the universe. The red dust rose in waves off the main road, and every horse and every person moved slower and drank more water and forgave each other minor transgressions on account of the heat. But the mornings were different. In the mornings, before the sun climbed high enough to be punishing, the air over the hills east of town was clear and still, and carried the smell of cedar and dry grass and the distant creek. Opal came out to the ranch every Sunday morning now. They had established it as a fact without ever formally discussing it, the way certain things between two careful people become established through repetition rather than declaration, through the accumulation of small, ordinary moments until the absence of them would feel strange. They worked on different things each week. They repaired a section of fence near the south pasture, where one of the cedar posts had rotted through. They cleared a blocked drainage channel that was causing the yard near the barn to flood during the occasional summer storms. Opal brought seedlings she had started from her boarding house garden, and Walter dug holes for them in the kitchen garden, with the focused, quiet competence he brought to all physical tasks. And one afternoon he brought out an old book of ranch records, and they sat on the porch steps going through it together, because she had mentioned knowing something about bookkeeping from her time in Missouri. And he said, with the understatement she was growing to love, that the accounts had gotten somewhat disorganized. They talked during all of this, carefully at first, in the edited way of people who are not sure yet how much of themselves is safe to offer, and then less carefully, and then with the increasing ease of two people discovering that they were, fundamentally, in conversation with someone who would not use what they said against them. She told him about her mother, who had been the most competent person she had ever known, and who had died of a fever when Opal was 23. She told him about the farm in Missouri, which had been beautiful in the spring and brutal in the winter, and which she had loved in spite of and because of all its demands. She told him about coming to Texas because Missouri had felt, after everything fell apart, like a room she had outgrown in some important way, not because of anything that had happened there, but because of everything that had not. He told her about Kansas, about growing up on a cattle ranch that his father had worked hard and lost hard when Walter was 17, which was when he had met Cobb Perkins on a cattle drive, both of them hired on as trail hands because they needed work and had no better options. He told her that Cobb had been the kind of man who laughed loud and meant it, and who genuinely believed in people even when they gave him no reason to, and that losing him had knocked something loose in Walter that he had never quite managed to set back in place. "What was it like?" she asked one Sunday afternoon, sitting on the porch with the coffee he had made, which was strong enough to stop a clock but which she had learned to appreciate the first year after. He looked out across the dry grass toward the hills. "Like a long silence," he said. "You know how when you have been near something loud for a very long time, machinery or a waterfall or a crowd, and then it stops, there is a period where your ears keep expecting the noise and the quiet is almost louder than the noise was. Like that, except that the sound you were missing was another person, another person's voice, the sounds a person makes just by being present." She sat with that for a moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. "Yes," she said, "I know that." He looked at her. "You do." "When my mother died, the house was so quiet I started sleeping on the porch some nights just so I could hear the animals in the barn." Something moved through his eyes, recognition, kinship, that precise frequency she had identified so early between them. He did not say he was sorry in the hollow, reflexive way. He just looked at her with full attention and said, "Did it help?" "Sometimes," she said. "Other times I just ended up cold and tired and still sad, but at least I had tried something." He almost laughed. It was close, the closest she had ever gotten him. The lines at the corners of his eyes deepened and his shoulders shifted, and the sound that came out was low and brief but genuine, and Opal thought it was possibly the finest thing she had ever heard. It was in the middle of August, on a Tuesday that smelled of rain, that the situation with Harlan Pryor came to a head. Harlan Pryor was a man of about 40 who had taken the property adjoining Walter Reed's to the north, arriving in Harrow Creek in late spring with money enough to purchase land and cattle and the intention, he made clear to everyone, of establishing a serious cattle operation. He was not, by strict definition, a bad man. He was simply the particular kind of ambitious man who had never been adequately checked in his ambitions, and had therefore concluded that what he wanted was what was right. What he wanted, it turned out, included a piece of Walter Reed's water rights. The creek that ran through Walter's property was the cleanest and most reliable water source in the area, and Pryor's northern pasture, which was dry and poorly watered, would benefit enormously from an easement. He had come to Walter twice with offers, reasonable ones, financially, and Walter had declined twice, politely but clearly. The creek was the backbone of the ranch's viability, and Walter was not in a position to share it without significant risk to his own operation. On the Tuesday in question, Opal was in the mercantile when she overheard Harlan Pryor telling two men near the feed counter that Walter Reed was being unreasonable, and that there were ways to handle an unreasonable man. She did not like the way he said it. She did not like the flat certainty of his tone or the nods of the two men who were listening. She bought her supplies and walked directly to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Tom Aldridge was 60 years old, weathered as old leather, and possessed of an essentially accurate understanding of what his job required of him in a town like Harrow Creek. He listened to Opal with the focused patience of a man who took things seriously only when they actually warranted it, and when she finished he said, "Reed know about this." "I do not know. I will ride out and talk to him this afternoon. I appreciate the information, Miss Doyle." She went out to the ranch herself that evening without waiting for Sunday, because some things could not wait for Sunday. Walter was in the barn when she arrived, mending a halter, and he looked up when she came in with that combination of surprise and something that was no longer quite surprise, a warmth that crossed his face briefly before he contained it. "You came on a Tuesday," he said. "I did," she said. "I heard something in town that you should know about." She told him about Pryor's conversation at the feed counter. Walter listened without interrupting. When she finished, he set the halter down slowly. "He has been pushing at this since April," he said. "I did not think he would push further than words." "Men like that often do," she said. "Has the sheriff spoken to you?" "Aldridge rode out about 2 hours ago. He told me much the same thing you did and said he would have a word with Pryor." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for coming to tell me." "Of course," she said. Then, because she had been holding it and had no reason to hold it any longer, "Walter, you know you do not have to manage everything alone anymore." He looked at her, really looked at her. The barn was dim and golden in the evening light, and the horses shifted in their stalls with soft, rhythmic sounds, and outside the creek made its steady, indifferent music over the stones. "Opal," he said slowly, and the way he said her name carefully, with the same deliberate attention he gave everything he said, as if it mattered, made something in her chest go quiet and certain. "I am saying that you have someone now," she said. "If you want that, if you are ready to want it. I am not going anywhere, and I am not fragile, and I have been coming out here on Sundays for 2 months, and I would not be doing that if I did not." She stopped, started again. "I am not very good at speaking around things," she said. "I am very good at speaking directly at things." "I have noticed that," he said. His voice was low. "I care about you," she said. "I think about you when I am not here. I think you are a good man who has been carrying too much alone for too long, and I think you deserve someone who wants to sit at a table with you. Someone who will come on a Tuesday when something is wrong, not just on Sundays when everything is fine." The silence stretched between them, but it was not an empty silence. It was the silence of something gathering itself. He crossed the barn in 4 steps and stood in front of her, and he reached up and carefully, with those calloused, weathered hands, tucked the loose strand of hair back from her face, and she looked up at him. And whatever was in his eyes right then was the most honest thing she had ever been shown. "I have not known what to do with how I feel about you," he said. "I did not know I was still capable of feeling it." "You are," she told him. "I know that now." He let his hand drop to her face, his thumb light against her cheekbone. "Opal, Walter." He kissed her with the same careful gravity that characterized everything he did, and she kissed him back with the directness that characterized everything she did. And the horses shuffled in their stalls, and the creek kept running, and outside the Texas night came down over the hills in shades of indigo and rose. The issue with Harlan Pryor resolved itself with the help of Sheriff Aldridge's firm intervention, and Pryor's eventual realization that any legal challenge to Walter's water rights was not something the law would support within 2 weeks. Pryor settled eventually for digging a well on his own property, which was the solution everyone with sense had been recommending from the beginning. Walter made sure his fence line was clearly marked and his paperwork in order, and Opal helped him organize the deed documents and water rights records into a proper system she had learned from her father, who had been meticulous about documentation, even when everything else on the farm was in disarray. September came in on a cooler wind, and the ranch changed with it. Opal came out most evenings now, not just Sundays, sometimes bringing food from the saloon. Hector packed a basket occasionally with leftovers, having taken an approving but entirely silent interest in the situation. And they would sit on the porch after the work of the day was done, and watch the stars come out over the hills with the comfortable quiet of two people who had found, unexpectedly and with great relief, that they could simply exist in each other's presence without performance. One September evening, she brought a full meal in a basket: corn soup, roasted chicken, apple slices with dried sugar she had gotten from the mercantile, and she set it out on the small table on the porch, and they ate together as the sun went down. And at some point midway through the meal she became aware that Walter had gone very still. She looked at him. He was looking at the table, at the two plates and the two cups and the food between them, and his expression was, she searched for the word, overwhelmed, but quietly. Not dramatically, not tearfully, but in the internal, tectonic way of a man who has had something shift inside him that has been locked in place for a very long time. "You all right?" she asked softly. He looked up. His eyes were bright. "I had not eaten a meal at a table with another person in 4 years," he said. The simplicity of the statement, the weight of those 4 years in every syllable, made her throat tighten. "I know," she said. "It is good," he said. "It is very good to not be eating alone." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they stayed like that for a moment with the cooling Texas air around them and the first stars beginning to show and the creek making its sound below. "You will not have to again," she said. "Not if I have anything to say about it." He looked at her with something she could only call devotion, careful, certain, long considered, not the flash of infatuation but the deep, permanent kind that settles in when something true has been recognized. "Stay," he said. It was a word he would not have said a month ago, and they both knew it, and the knowing of it made the word larger than its size. "I will stay as long as you want me here," she said. "That is going to be a very long time," he told her, and she believed him completely. The autumn deepened around them. October in that part of Texas was the kindest season, when the brutal heat broke and the light went amber, and the mesquite turned shades of gold and rust, and the cattle fattened on the improved pasture grass. Walter hired on a part-time hand, a young man of 20 named Eli Tanner, who was looking for steady work, and who turned out to be reliable, cheerful, and completely untroubled by the presence of a woman at the ranch, which Walter had apparently worried about for approximately 5 minutes before deciding not to worry about at all. Eli was the first person to see them together in any formal sense, and his response was to say, "Morning, Miss Doyle," each time she arrived with the natural ease of someone who found this arrangement perfectly logical, which it was. Opal liked him immediately. The harvest from the kitchen garden was better than either of them expected. The late summer tending had paid off generously, and they put up tomatoes and beans and dried herbs, and Walter brought down a deer in the first week of November, and they spent an entire Sunday working the meat and talking and laughing more than she had thought he was capable of laughing. And by the time the evening star rose that night she was certain, in the clearest possible way, of what she wanted. She told Delia, who had become a genuine friend over the course of the summer. They were walking to the well one November morning when Opal said, without preamble, "I think I want to marry Walter Reed." Delia, who was carrying her baby on one hip and a water bucket on the other and who was one of the most practical women Opal had ever met, said, "Does he know that?" "Not yet," Opal said. "You could tell him," Delia said. "I am considering it," Opal said. "You are a woman who speaks directly at things," Delia reminded her with a smile. "I am," Opal agreed. She did not tell him that week because she was thinking about how, not whether. With Walter Reed, the how mattered enormously. He was not a man who needed to be surprised or swept up. He was a man who needed to feel that what was being asked of him was something he had the freedom to meet fully and deliberately, not because it was thrust upon him, but because he chose it with his whole self. She understood that down to her bones. She told him on a Saturday evening in late November, the first cold evening of the season, when they were sitting inside by the fire because outside the temperature had dropped sharply and the north wind had teeth. He had made coffee, she had brought apple cake from the boarding house, and they were sitting across from each other at the table inside, not the porch table but the kitchen table, the one that had been there for years, that two men had built the whole ranch around, and Opal thought there was something right about that. "Walter," she said, setting her cup down. "Yes," he said, looking at her. "I want to marry you," she said. "I want to live here. I want to work this land with you and grow things in the garden and help you with the accounts and come in from the cold in the evenings and sit at this table with you for the rest of our lives. I want that very much." Looked at her for a long moment. She did not fill the silence because she had said what needed to be said, and now it was his turn. "I want that too," he said. "I have wanted it for longer than I have been willing to admit, even to myself." He paused, and the firelight moved across his face, and he looked like a man who had been returned to himself. "I do not have a ring to offer you yet." "I am not asking about a ring," she said. "No," he agreed. "You are asking about forever." "Yes," she said. He stood up from his chair and came around the table, and she stood up to meet him, and he took her face in both his hands the way he had in the barn that night in August, and he said, "Opal Doyle, I would very much like to spend the rest of my life eating meals at this table with you." She smiled so wide it hurt. "That is the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me," she told him. "That was a low bar," he said, smiling back, and now the smile was full and real, and it changed his entire face, and she thought she would do many things to keep seeing it. "Marry me," she said. "Yes," he said, without any reservation at all. "Yes." They were married on the first Saturday of December at the small whiteboard church at the edge of Harrow Creek, which had a minister named Pastor Hale, who performed ceremonies with an earnest, unhurried grace that suited the occasion well. The church held 40 people comfortably. It held approximately 53 that morning, because Walter Reed had been a part of Harrow Creek longer than most people realized. And Opal Doyle, in 3 months at the dusty spur, had made more friends than she had known, and word of the wedding had spread in that particular way of small frontier towns where nothing stayed private for long. Gus Halloran came, scrubbed pink and wearing a suit that had been well preserved in a trunk since a wedding in Dublin in 1861. Delia came with her baby, who slept through the entire ceremony with improbable serenity. Hector came and stood in the back, and could be observed to wipe his eyes once firmly, and did not speak of it afterward. Sheriff Aldridge came and sat in the third row and nodded with solemn approval. Eli Tanner came wearing his best shirt and his worst hat and beamed throughout, as if personally responsible for the whole affair, which in a small way he was, since it had been his casual, accepting presence at the ranch that had given Opal the freedom to spend her evenings there without complication. Even several of the cattle buyers who passed through Harrow Creek on a rotating circuit had heard about it and stopped in specifically to witness the occasion, which said something about the particular quality of a story about a man who had been alone for 4 years finding his way back to a table set for two. Opal wore a deep blue dress she had ordered from the mercantile catalog, made of fine woven wool, and her hair was down and pinned with small white dried flowers from the garden. Walter wore his best clothes, which were not, by Eastern standards, particularly impressive, but which were clean and well-fitted, and which he wore with a straight-back dignity that made him look, she thought, exactly like himself, only more deliberately so. Pastor Hale asked them to speak their vows, the standard ones, and Walter said his with the careful, measured weight he gave to everything important, making every word sound like a choice rather than a recitation. And when he said, "Until death do us part," he looked at her with the clear-eyed understanding of a man who knew exactly what loss felt like and was choosing this anyway, because of that knowledge and not in spite of it. Opal said her vows with the directness that was her nature, looking him steadily in the eyes. And when she said, "to have and to hold," she thought about the specific warmth of his hand covering hers on the porch table that September evening, and she meant it with every part of herself. After the ceremony, the Dusty Spur hosted an informal celebration. Gus had opened the saloon to the wedding party with the magnanimity of a man who was also going to profit slightly from the arrangement. And there was music from a fiddle player named Obadiah Crane, who was 70 years old and played with the energy of someone a third his age. And there was food, and there was dancing, and there was the particular social warmth of a community that was, beneath all its rough frontier edges, genuinely glad when things went right for people it had watched struggle. Walter danced with Opal. He was not a natural dancer. He moved with the careful deliberateness of a man translating instructions from his head to his feet in real time. But he held her well, and he did not once take his eyes from her face, and she thought that was more than sufficient. At the end of the evening, they rode out of town together on 2 horses, Walter's bay and the gray mare that Gus had finally sold to Opal at a fair price in October. And the December night was cold and bright with stars, and the road was silver in the moonlight, and Walter Reed, who had not spoken of happiness in a very long time, said quietly as they rode, "I had forgotten what this was." "What?" she asked. "Coming home and having it mean something," he said. She reached across the distance between their horses and found his hand in the cold air and held it for a moment, and he squeezed her fingers once, firm and certain. They came up over the rise and saw the ranch below them, lit by a lantern Eli Tanner had left burning in the window, because that young man had more genuine kindness in him than most people twice his age, and Walter had left him in charge of the animals for the evening, and the lantern in the window of the house looked like exactly what it was, a light waiting for someone to come home to it. "There it is," Opal said softly. "There it is," Walter agreed. December passed in the way of good Decembers in the Texas Hill Country, cold enough to feel like the world was resting, warm enough during the midday hours to do the work that always needed doing. They settled into the house together with the unsentimental practicality of 2 people who had both done hard things and knew that love without labor was a fine idea but a limited reality. Opal rearranged the kitchen, which Walter accepted without complaint and with occasional helpful input about where he tended to put things. Walter fixed the window frame in the bedroom that had been rattling for 2 years, which Opal noted had been a remarkable development in their domestic situation. They established a rhythm of mornings and evenings and work days that felt, increasingly, like something built to last. She left her job at the Dusty Spur. There had been a conversation about it. She had not assumed she would simply stop working because she had married, because that was not how she thought about herself, and she had brought it to Walter as a topic requiring discussion. He had listened to her full accounting of the reasoning, which included both the financial aspects and the personal ones, and then he said that the ranch had 3 sources of income, and one of them was the sale of timber rights on the eastern quarter, which he had never fully organized, and would she want to take that on because the paperwork alone was defeating him? She said yes, and that settled the question, and they shook hands on it at the kitchen table with the grave seriousness of business partners, and then laughed at themselves, and Walter kissed her and the accounting waited until afternoon. January brought a cold snap that put ice on the creek for 3 days and kept the cattle close to the barn. It also brought a letter, forwarded through the Harrow Creek post from a town in Kansas, addressed to Walter and written in a handwriting Opal did not recognize. She brought it in from the mailbox and set it on the kitchen table, and when Walter came in from the barn he saw it and stopped. "Kansas postmark," she said. He picked it up. He looked at it for a long moment without opening it. Then he sat down at the table and broke the seal. She watched his face while he read. She watched the careful, controlled expression, and then she watched it change, a slow opening, like a door that has been swollen shut working loose in its frame. He read the letter twice. Then he set it down, "It is from Davis," he said. Davis, the younger hand who had left after Cobb's death. "He is in Wichita. He says he has been thinking about coming back to Texas." Opal was quiet. "He says he left because he could not stay," Walter said, looking at the letter. "Because being here after Cobb was too hard. He says he has been sorry about it since." He paused. "He asks if there is still a place for him here." "Is there?" Opal asked. Walter looked up at her. "I have been thinking about expanding the cattle operation in the spring. Eli is good, but he is young and I need someone with more experience. Davis ran the cattle end of things for 3 years. "Do you want him back?" she asked. He thought about it, really thought about it, with that deliberate honesty that was one of the things she loved best about him. "Yes," he said. "I think I do. I was angry when he left, but I understand it better now. I understand choosing to leave a place that has too much grief in it." He looked at her. "And now the ranch has less grief in it," she smiled. "Write him back," she said. "I will," he said, "tonight." Davis returned to the ranch in February. A man of 29 now, dark-haired and lean, with the look of someone who had spent 4 years in various places that were not where he wanted to be. He arrived with his horse and a single pack and his hat in his hands, metaphorically speaking, and he and Walter stood in the yard looking at each other for a moment with the complicated arithmetic of two people who have a shared history of loss and a present that is different from the past. "Read," Davis said. "Davis," Walter said. And then Walter put out his hand and Davis shook it, and that was most of what needed to be said about forgiveness, though the rest of it came out later, over coffee at the kitchen table with Opal present, in the slow and honest way of men who are not good at the thing but understand it needs doing. Opal liked Davis immediately. He was funny, with a dry humor that took a moment to arrive, and he was genuinely good with cattle, which she could tell from the way Eli Tanner, who knew cattle with an instinctive quality, talked about the improvements to the operation within 2 weeks of Davis's return. Davis, for his part, treated Opal with a respectful ease that told her she had been mentioned positively in whatever conversation Walter had written in his letter, which she found charming. One evening over supper in March, beef and corn and the last of the winter carrots, Davis looked around the kitchen table and said, with his dry timing, "It is different in here than it used to be." "Different how?" Walter asked. "Good different," Davis said. "Quieter in a different way. Used to be quiet because there was nothing. Now it is quiet because things are settled." He looked at Opal. "I hope you plan on staying, Mrs. Reed. The place makes a lot more sense with you in it." "I plan on it," she said, and under the table Walter's hand found hers and held it, and the fire in the hearth made the room warm, and outside the March wind moved through the new grass on the hills, and spring was coming to the ranch with the full, unhurried intention of staying. April arrived like a debt being paid. The kitchen garden exploded with the energy of plants well prepared. The tomatoes came up strong from the seedlings she had started in February on the south-facing windowsill. The beans wound themselves up the pole stakes she and Walter had set on a warm Sunday in early April. The herbs filled the air with the smell of rosemary and sage when the wind came through. Walter had added a small orchard section to the east of the garden. 4 apple trees they had purchased from a nursery in San Antonio and transported with considerable difficulty. And they would not fruit this year, but they would fruit eventually. And Opal thought there was something deeply satisfying about planting things you might not see the full reward of immediately. She was out in the garden one morning in mid-April when Walter came out from the barn and leaned on the fence post watching her work, and when she stood up and stretched he said, "Are you all right?" "I am fine," she said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "You went to bed early the past 3 nights," he said. "And you did not eat all your supper on Tuesday." She looked at him. He was watching her with that careful, attentive quality of a man who had learned to notice things because not noticing had once cost him everything. "I am fine," she said again, more gently. "I have just been tired." She did not say more than that because she was not entirely certain yet, but she was fairly certain. She had been tracking the certainty for about a week. She confirmed it with the knowledge she carried. Her mother had been a midwife's apprentice briefly, and Opal knew enough to know what she knew, and she chose her moment with care. It was a Sunday evening, the last Sunday of April, and they had just finished supper, and the plates were still on the table between them, and the candle was burning low, and Walter was refilling their cups with coffee that was slightly less nuclear than his early efforts because she had gently guided him toward a different brewing method over the course of the winter. "Walter," she said. "Yes," he said. "We are going to have a baby," she said. He looked at her. He set the coffee pot down very carefully on the table. He looked at her again, and something moved through his face that was large and slow and profound, like weather moving over the land. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Fairly sure," she said. "I will be more certain in another month." He reached across the table and took both her hands in both of his, and he looked down at their joined hands, and he was quiet for a long moment, and when he looked up his eyes were very bright. "Opal," he said, and there was everything in it, gratitude and joy and something that was very close to reverence. And beneath all of it, beneath the joy, something she recognized as the particular vulnerability of a man who had lost someone and who understood, therefore, in his bones, both the value and the fragility of what he was being given. "We are going to be all right," she told him, reading what was underneath, because that was one of the things she did. She read the underneath of him with the same patient attention she brought to the garden, to the accounts, to everything she cared about. "You are going to be a wonderful father." He swallowed. "I hope so," he said. "I know so," she said. He stood up and came around the table and knelt beside her chair, a gesture so unexpected from this contained, deliberate man that she drew in a breath. And he put his arms around her and held her with the full, careful strength of someone protecting something infinitely valuable. And she put her cheek against the top of his head and wrapped her arms around him, and thought that the distance from the corner table at the dusty spur to this moment had been the best 4 miles she had ever traveled. The summer of 1879 passed with the particular richness of a time when everything that needed to happen was happening. The cattle operation expanded, with Davis managing the herd and Eli handling the daily work and Walter overseeing the whole with his quiet, competent authority. The ranch turned a real profit for the first time in 4 years. Opal completed the timber rights organization, and they sold the first annual rights in June for a sum that would cover the new fence line and the building of a proper root cellar, which they set to constructing in July. She continued at the ranch through the summer, doing the work she was capable of and declining to be treated as fragile by anyone, though she accepted the fact that Walter checked on her with a frequency that was sometimes excessive and always endearing. He had a particular habit in the evenings of sitting beside her on the porch and asking if there was anything she needed, and she always said no or sometimes yes. A glass of water, a blanket when the evenings turned cool, and he always brought it without comment and sat back down, and she thought that this steady, quiet, attentive presence was one of the great gifts that a certain kind of love offered, not drama but reliability. Not grand gestures, but the small continuous evidence of a person showing up. Davis had taken to cooking supper on Tuesdays, which had started as a practical arrangement and had evolved into something slightly competitive, because it turned out Davis had a genuine talent for cooking that he had been hiding in the back of practical competence, and Hector at the Dusty Spur, when Opal mentioned this, expressed a professional skepticism she found entirely reasonable. Davis's cornbread was, objectively, excellent. She would not tell Hector this. September arrived, and with it, the knowledge that the baby was coming in the late fall, and Opal began the practical preparations with the same organized efficiency she brought to the timber rights, and the kitchen garden and everything else she cared about. She corresponded with a doctor in San Antonio who had been recommended by the wife of a rancher south of town, and she arranged for Delia, who, in addition to being a good friend, had now survived childbirth herself and had opinions about everything related to it, to be present when the time came. The baby came in the first week of November, On a night when the north wind was running hard across the hills, and the ranch house was warm with the fire Walter had kept going since the previous afternoon when it became clear they were entering the final hours. Delia was there. The doctor had come out from San Antonio 2 days early and stayed at the ranch because the timing was close, which Walter had arranged with the single-minded determination of a man who was going to ensure that nothing went wrong. And the doctor, a sensible man named Dr. Clement Howell, who had delivered more children than he could count and had a gift for calming frightened people, found Walter Reed to be a challenge in this regard, since Walter was not frightened in any visible external sense but radiated a kind of tightly controlled concern that was perhaps more difficult to manage than outright panic. "You should go wait in the kitchen," Opal told him, not unkindly, at one point during the proceedings. "I am fine here," he said. "Walter," he looked at her. "Kitchen," she said, firmly but with a smile that took the edge off it. He went to the kitchen. Davis was there. Eli was there. The three of them sat around the kitchen table with coffee that no one was drinking and the fire going and the wind outside, and they waited with the various patience and impatience of men who are engaged in the hardest kind of waiting, the kind where there is nothing to do. At 11:30 on that November night, a son was born to Walter and Opal Reed, and his first sound was the particular enormous declaration of a healthy newborn who has strong opinions about the outside world. Walter, who had been halfway out of his chair at the sound of it, heard Delia's voice from the other room saying clearly, "A boy, a healthy boy," and he sat very still for one moment with his hands on the table and his eyes closed, and then he stood up. The doctor came out first, smiling. "Mrs. Reed is well," he said. "The child is strong. You may go in." Walter Reed walked through that door with a steadiness that cost him something, and Opal was there, tired and luminous in the lamplight, and in her arms was a small, red-faced, intensely present human being who was looking at the world with the great seriousness of the newly arrived. "Come and meet him," Opal said. Walter came to the edge of the bed and looked down at his son, and the expression on his face was beyond anything she had vocabulary for. It contained the full 4 years of silence and loss, and the slow return from that silence. And it contained every meal at the corner table of the dusty spur, and every Sunday in the garden, and every evening on the porch, and the feel of her hand in his. And it contained Cobb, too, she thought. Some acknowledgement of the friend who had not lived to see this but whose presence was woven into everything that had made it possible. "Hello," Walter said to his son, very quietly. The baby turned his head toward the sound of the voice with the blind, accurate instinct of the newborn, and Walter's composure, which had held through the whole long evening, gave way briefly, privately, in the way of a man who does not cry easily and does not make a display of it when he does, and Opal reached up and found his hand and held it. They named him Cobb Walter Reed, without much discussion, because it was simply the right thing to do. Cobb Walter Reed announced his arrival in Harrow Creek society with the natural authority of a baby who had opinions about everything, and the town received him with the warmth of a community that had been following his parents' story with considerable interest. Gus Halloran sent a bottle of good whiskey and a card written in his broad, cheerful hand. Hector sent a covered dish of something that turned out to be the best beef stew Opal had eaten since before she left Missouri, which she found quietly moving. Delia, who came to help in the first weeks, proved to be as practically gifted with other people's babies as with her own. Sheriff Aldridge came out to the ranch and stood holding the baby with the solemn care of a man handling something irreplaceable, which Opal found touchingly apt. Davis and Eli, in their respective ways, were entirely undone by the baby. Eli simply looked at him with the pure, uncomplicated delight of a young man encountering something wonderful. Davis, who was more contained, was discovered on 3 separate occasions talking to the baby in the doorway to the kitchen, having apparently decided that Cobb was a person worth addressing directly and at some length on various topics including the current state of the cattle market. Walter was, as Opal had known he would be, a natural father. Not in the easy, unself-conscious way of people who have never doubted themselves. He was too honest for that, but in the profound, attentive way of a man who understood that the job was the most serious thing he had ever undertaken and treated it accordingly. He was up in the nights when the baby was restless. He learned every preference and protest with the patient, systematic care he brought to understanding cattle weather or soil quality. He held Cobb against his chest in the evenings while the fire burned low and talked to him in the same low, careful voice he used with everything important. And Opal would come out of the kitchen doorway sometimes and just watch them for a moment, the big, weathered man and the small, serious baby, and feel something so full and warm in her chest that she had to stop what she was doing to let it be. December came, and with it, the first anniversary of their wedding. They celebrated it quietly, with a good meal at the kitchen table, and a bottle of wine that Davis had contributed with the air of a man making a significant sacrifice on their behalf. Eli was gone for the evening, having been invited to supper at a neighboring homesteader's family, where a daughter of approximately his age and considerable intelligence had recently arrived from Ohio, and with whom he was conducting a cautious, earnest courtship that Opal found deeply charming. Cobb slept in the next room, and the fire was going, and the December wind was outside, and Opal and Walter sat at the kitchen table with their wine and the remains of a good supper, and they talked, the way they had been talking for a year and a half now. Easily, honestly, without performance or editing, the talk of two people who have each found the one person in the world to whom they can say the actual truth. "I have been thinking," Opal said at some point in the evening, "about what you said last December riding home from the wedding." "What did I say?" he asked. "You said you had forgotten what it was like to come home and have it mean something." He looked at her across the table. "I remember. Does it still?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with those gray-green eyes that had first caught her attention in a crowded saloon, the eyes that she had read correctly from the beginning as belonging to a good man who had been hurt in ways he had not figured out how to be unhurt from yet. He looked at the table between them, the wine glasses, the candle, the cleared plates, the evidence of an ordinary evening shared between two people who had chosen each other. "Opal," he said, "it means everything." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, the way she had that September evening on the porch, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that in the warmth of the fire with their son sleeping in the next room and the year behind them and all the years ahead. Spring came again to the ranch east of Harrow Creek. The apple trees they had planted put out their first small crop, modest, the way first things are, but real, and Opal made apple preserves with them in August and put them up in jars on the kitchen shelf, and felt the long patience of the gesture with profound satisfaction. The kitchen garden was better than it had ever been. She had added a second plot to the east and was growing enough now to sell a modest surplus at the Harrow Creek Mercantile on a monthly basis, which she did partly for the income and partly because she genuinely liked Mrs. Elaine Ortega, who ran the Mercantile with her husband and who had become a friend over the course of the past year. Davis had met a woman in town, a schoolteacher named Margaret Finch, who had come to Harrow Creek from Tennessee to run the small school that had opened in the spring. Margaret was forthright and funny and clearly found Davis's dry humor a match worth making, and their courtship proceeded with a dignity and seriousness that Walter watched with the quiet, approving attention of a man who recognized quality when he saw it. Eli had resolved his courtship of the Ohio girl, whose name was Clara, by simply asking her father for permission to court her properly, which he had done with a directness that surprised everyone who did not know Eli well, which was to say most people. Clara's father, a taciturn homesteader named Abbott, had said yes mainly because he had watched Eli work for 2 years and concluded he was a young man of substance, which he was. Cobb, who was growing with the alarming speed of all healthy babies, and who had developed by summer the decisive opinions and physical determination of a child who was going to be his father's height and his mother's temperament, was walking by October, and was into everything by November, and was, by universal agreement among everyone at the ranch, the most interesting person present at any given time. On a November evening in 1880, 2 years after the wedding and a year after Cobb's birth, Opal sat at the kitchen table after supper with a letter she was writing to Delia, who had moved with her daughter to a homestead south of town with her new husband, a steady and good-natured man named Philip Crane, who was a distant relative of the fiddle-playing Obadiah. Walter was in the sitting room reading by the lamp, and Cobb was asleep in his room down the hall, and the fire in the kitchen hearth was warm against the November cold, and outside the stars were very clear over the hill country. She set her pen down and listened to the particular quality of the evening. The house breathed around her. She could hear, faintly, the sound of Walter turning a page. She could hear the distant sound of the creek. She could hear the horses in the barn, settled and quiet. She could hear the fire. She thought about the corner table in the dusty spur, and the man who had sat at it for 4 years with his back to the wall and his eyes toward the door and his coffee going cold beside him. She thought about the Sunday mornings in the garden and the porch evenings and the barn and the candles she had noticed burning low. She thought about the meal she had carried out in a basket on a September evening, and the way he had gone still looking at the 2 plates between them. She had not known, when she pulled out that chair across from him, what would follow. She had not known about the 4 years or the depth of the silence he had been living inside or the size of what she was, without fully intending to, beginning. She had simply recognized a person who needed someone to sit across from him, and she had been willing to be that person, and everything else had followed from that as naturally and irrevocably as rain following the sky. She heard Walter get up from his chair. She heard his footsteps cross the floor. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, filling it in the way he always did, his hat off and his sleeves rolled and his expression the quiet, settled one that was his face's natural expression now, the one that was different from the closed, weathered look he had carried into the dusty spur on those early Wednesday evenings. Warm, present, hers. "Are you coming to bed?" he asked. "In a little while," she said. "I am finishing this letter to Delia." He crossed the kitchen and kissed the top of her head as he passed her chair, and she felt the warmth of his hand on her shoulder for a moment, and then he went to the stove to bank the fire for the night. "Walter," she said. "Yes," he said, not turning around. "I am glad I sat down," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to look at her, and there it was, the thing she had first glimpsed as a faint possibility in the tired, careful face of a man eating alone, that full, certain, luminous look that was both completely new to her and also as familiar as anything she had ever known. "So am I," he said, "every single day." She finished her letter. He waited for her. They went to bed in the ranch house they had made into a home, with Cobb sleeping down the hall in Davis, and Margaret in the small house they had built on the north end of the property in the early fall, and Eli in his bunkhouse room dreaming, probably, of Clara Abbott, and the horses in the barn and the creek in the dark, and the stars over the Texas hill country doing what they had always done, which was to keep shining whether anyone was watching or not. In the spring of 1881, Opal told Walter she was expecting again, at the kitchen table in the morning light, over the coffee he had made that was now genuinely good because she had shown him twice, and the third time he had figured it out himself. He received the news with the full joy of a man who had learned, the hard way, that joy was worth feeling without reservation. He stood up from his chair and pulled her to her feet and held her with both arms, and she could feel his heartbeat against her face, steady and strong and unafraid. Their daughter arrived in September, under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. They named her Clara Ruth Reed, after no one in particular but for the sound of it, which was good and clear, and fit the particular quality of the morning she came into the world. Cobb Walter Reed, 2 years old and possessed of serious opinions, regarded his sister with the focused attention of someone conducting a formal investigation, and ultimately declared her acceptable by the means of placing one small, careful hand on her head, which was the most formal approval in his power to bestow. Margaret and Davis were married the following spring. Walter stood up with Davis at the ceremony, and Opal stood with Margaret, and when they sat together afterward at the long table that Eli and two neighbors had built in the yard for the occasion, eating food that seemed to have been contributed by everyone in Harrow Creek who knew how to cook anything, the afternoon light was gold over the hills, and the apple trees in the orchard were in bloom, and Opal looked down the table at the people gathered there, Davis laughing at something Margaret had said. Eli sitting with his arm around Clara Abbott, who had said yes in December and would become Clara Tanner in the summer, Gus Halloran raising his glass, Delia across the table with her daughter. On her knee, Sheriff Aldridge looking on with the solemn satisfaction of a man who had seen too much trouble and appreciated the sight of things going right. And beside her, Walter Reed, who had his son in his lap and his hand in hers, and who was looking at the table with the same expression he had worn that September evening on the porch, when she had brought a meal out in a basket, overwhelmed, quietly, in the tectonic way, except that now the expression was not the first shock of it but the deep, settled accumulation of 2 years of meals and mornings and evenings, and sleeping and waking and working and talking and building, and making a life together with your whole self. He felt her looking at him and turned to meet her eyes. "Good day," he said. "The best," she said. He raised his cup. She raised hers. Cobb, between them, reached up and grabbed the table edge and pulled himself to a precarious standing position with the determination of someone who had somewhere important to be, and they both caught him, simultaneously, their hands meeting around his small, determined body, steady and certain, the way they had caught everything that mattered between them from the very beginning. The ranch east of Harrow Creek grew over the years the way good things grow, not explosively, not at the cost of everything around them, but steadily, putting down roots while reaching upward, adding to itself while remaining recognizable. The kitchen garden expanded, then expanded again, and the apple trees fruited properly for the first time in 1883, with an abundance that filled the root cellar and the pantry shelves, and still left enough for Opal to send baskets down to the mercantile, and to a dozen families she had come to know. The cattle operation ran well under Davis's experienced eye, and Eli Tanner, who was no longer young but was still cheerful, managed the day-to-day work with Clara. Beside him now on the adjacent quarter section they had purchased and fenced and were building into a home of their own. Walter Reed, who had sat in a corner for 4 years looking at the door as if waiting for something that would not come, had found in the years since his wedding the particular ease of a man who has made peace with his history and his present simultaneously. He talked more, not voluminously, not with any sudden effusion, but with the steady increase of a man whose silences are no longer reflexive protection but genuine preference, the kind of quiet that comes from fullness rather than emptiness. He laughed more. He carried less of the invisible weight that Opal had recognized in him across a saloon floor in the spring of 1878. He visited Cobb Perkins' grave on the anniversary of the accident every year, in the small cemetery on the south edge of Harrow Creek, and he brought something from the ranch each time, a flower from the garden, an apple from the orchard, a small thing that represented the life that had continued. And he stood there for a while in the way of a person keeping a long conversation going across the particular barrier that death creates. And then he came home and ate supper and was present, fully present, for the rest of the evening. One October afternoon in 1884, the Texas light going amber and long across the dry grass, the cattle moved to the south pasture, the garden put to bed for the winter, Opal found Walter sitting on the porch steps watching the road east in the way he sometimes did, the meditative, far-seeing look that she had once mistaken for emptiness and had come to understand, was simply the way his mind worked when it had something to turn over. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, sitting down beside him. He turned to look at her. Cobb Walter Reed, now 5 years old and built like his father was going to be built, was chasing a barn cat through the yard with the concentrated energy of the very young. Clara Ruth Reed, 3 years old and possessed of her mother's directness and her father's quiet watchfulness, was sitting on the bottom porch step very carefully constructing something out of sticks and pebbles with the focused ambition of a civil engineer. "I was thinking," Walter said, "about the first time you sat across from me." She waited. "I did not know that night," he said slowly, "what I was looking at. I thought you sat down because the room was busy. I thought you were being kind in the way of people who feel sorry for someone. It took me a long time to understand that it was not that." "What do you understand it to be now?" she asked. He looked at her with the full attention that was still, after 6 years, one of the finest gifts she had ever been given. "I understand it to be the bravest and most generous thing anyone has ever done for me," he said. "You looked at a man who had shut himself up completely and you sat across from him at a table and refused to let the shutting up stand. You did it without fanfare. You did it without any guarantee of return. You just sat down." She felt the warmth of it move through her from her chest outward. "You were worth sitting across from," she said simply. He took her hand, the way he did, firm and steady and utterly certain. "I am going to spend the rest of my life being grateful for that," he said. Down in the yard, Cobb caught the barn cat, discovered it had opinions about being caught, and released it with the philosophical equanimity of a child who had learned from a very early age that the world had dignity and should be respected. Clara looked up from her construction project and assessed her brother's failed enterprise, and returned to her own work without comment. "So am I," Opal said, and she leaned her head against Walter's shoulder, and the afternoon light went gold and longer over the ranch, and the creek kept running below, and the hills were the color of old copper in the October sun, and everything that had been broken and alone and silent had found its way, slowly and honestly and without shortcuts, to this. A table set for two that had become a table set for many. A corner that had been a fortress and was now a home. A man who had learned again to come through the door and find the lantern lit and the supper warm and the person he loved most in the world sitting across from him with her dark eyes and her direct way and her absolute, practical, magnificent refusal to let loneliness have the final word.